Hello, my name is Alexis Grimaldo and you're watching Fully Exposed, a show about my passion for analog photography and vintage cameras. Alright, basically this is a show that's going to be explaining the mystery of aperture. What is aperture? I've had a lot of friends who have gotten digital SLRs over the past few years and they don't even know what aperture is in relation to f-stops and light, all that kind of jazz. So this is just for them to kind of clear up the basics. The information I'm going to give you today is totally transferable whether you're using an analog film camera or a digital SLR where you have the ability to change aperture settings, f-stops, and shutter speeds and so on. Basically, aperture is just a hole, the size of the hole that lets light through it inside the lens. It's a little diaphragm with blades, and as you open the aperture it opens up like an iris, I guess like in your eye, and then as it closes, stops down, it closes and lets less light in. That's all it is. F-stops are the measurement for the size of the hole inside the lens. So basically, when you adjust the aperture, you're adjusting the size of the hole. The thing that throws people off a lot of times is the fact that the higher the number of the f-stop, let's say for instance f16, it seems like it's bigger, letting more light in, but that's actually the opposite. What it does is f16 is a small hole. In some cases it's the smallest hole. Some lenses can stop down to f22 and f32 or whatever. But in most cases, standard lenses are f16. And as you go down, you go f16, f11, f8, f5.6, f4. And as you go down, the iris actually opens up, okay, letting more light in. In most cases, the way you adjust the aperture, let's say on the manual lens, it's sometimes right on the lens itself. There's a ring. Like this is an old, beautiful, glorious Canon lens. And it's got a ring on the front. You hear clicks, and each click is a different aperture setting. And you can also probably, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this, you can actually see the iris opening and closing as I move through the f-stops. Another kind of camera, a twin lens reflex. This camera, this aperture setting, you adjust it by this little dial here. This little dial changes the f-stop internally, and there's a little window on the top here that'll tell you what f-stop you're in relation. So that's how you adjust the aperture in this camera. Now, a lot of people probably have digital SLRs and Nikons or Canons or whatever. And in most cases, what you do is you turn the camera on, you set it to manual. Manual setting on this camera, for instance, M. I'm sure it's the same with Nikon. And then this dial in the back here controls the f-stop. And you can see it when you're looking through. You can see the number change on the f-stop. So what that's doing is that's how you adjust manually the f-stop on a digital camera. Here's how f-stops kind of change the image. Okay, the wider open the f-stop, the narrower the depth of field. Meaning that when you focus on a point, the narrower the depth of field is, that subject is going to be in focus. But right in front of it is going to be out of focus, and right behind it is going to be out of focus. Pretty narrow. It's not very wide. So that's what the lens wide open. Let's say, for example, f2, f1.8, 1.7. As you go down, it's basically opening the iris, more. So that is sometimes a desired effect when you're shooting portraits. You don't want the background to take away from the foreground, what you're actually focusing on. You don't want it to distract from the subject that you're focusing on. It's a beautiful look. It works really good for portraits. It kind of softens the image overall, depending on the lens you have. The opposite of that is when you start stopping aperture down, let's say to around f8 or so, the lens is razor sharp. The depth of field is pretty wide. So that if you're shooting somebody and you want something behind them in focus as well, you're going to want to stop down the aperture, f8, f11, even f16 in some cases. Now for me personally, I float around 1.4 to f8. I don't really go above f8 too often. I like the way f8 is just really sharp. It's really good if I want to get real nice detail, real sharp edges and everything. And then f2 and down is more for portrait work or more of dreamy kind of looking pictures where I want the background to kind of blur. Certain lenses have really different kinds of out of focus areas when you have it wide open. Like my Leica, for example, which I'm going to put up some examples so you can see. A couple examples I shot, the ones where they're out of focus, the lights in the back kind of glow, and they call it kind of Leica glow, and it's kind of an old lens. The lens is from like 48, and it has this really cool out of focus kind of dreaminess to the background, and the foreground is still sharp enough, Some other examples that I've shot with the Leica with the same exact lens, but an f8, where I've shot some stuff and it's very crisp, beautiful detail and sharpness out of the same lens. Also, when you're shooting wide open, in the background, the detail gets very blurred in kind of a beautiful way. They call it bokeh. So certain lenses have different kinds of bokeh. And it's certain lenses. I find that the diaphragm with the more blades, so the more round the aperture is, tends to have a more interesting and soft bokeh. So it's prettier, it's less grainy looking. It's kind of like somebody painted the background, in some cases when you get extreme lenses that can stop, like this lens is an f1.2, so it can go wide open, and this just has amazing bokeh. So speaking of lenses, have you ever heard anybody say a fast lens versus a slow lens? Well, what they mean is the f-stop. The lens, in most cases, let's say with your digital SLRs, for example, the most open your aperture can go is like 3.5, f3.5 or f4, which really isn't that big of a hole. So that in turn they term that as a slower lens versus a lens that can go down to f2, f1.8, f1.4, and then f1.2, and probably the fastest I've seen is 0.95 or something like that. Okay, so what that means is the lens is faster, meaning you can let in more light when opened up all the way, and a slower lens can let in less light because the aperture can only open to f3 to f4. So that's what they mean when they mean faster or slower lens. Okay, one more thing I have to talk about that really can't be ignored is the Sunny 16 rule. It's a simple rule that's very simple to use with a manual camera. So meaning if you have a camera like my Leica that doesn't have a light meter in it, it's just fully manual. So in turn, what I do, let's say if I stick in a roll of 400 speed film, I set the shutter speed to 500. That's the closest, to that speed of film. Let's just say if I stuck in a roll of 200 film, I'd stick it at 250. If I stuck in a roll of 100 film, I'd stick it on 125. So that's basically all you do. So the shutter speed is directly related to the speed of the film you're putting in the camera. Now that's easy. Now basically once you have that set, you can leave it that way. So okay, the Sunny 16 rule, the other part of it is the f-stop. So Sunny 16 means basically that. When it's sunny outside, when you have good crisp shadows around you, and it's full bright, you're not in the shade, it's not overcast, you set the aperture to 16. And it'll be an exposure. It'll be, pretty good. If you go into maybe, it's a little overcast, the shadows aren't as crisp around the edges of your shadows, you can go to f11. Okay, so basically what you're doing is you're taking the small hole and you're making it a little bit bigger. So you're letting more light in, okay? And then as it gets more overcast and it gets harder, you probably might not even be able to see a shadow very much, a little bit of a shadow, you want to go to f8. So basically you're opening it even more. And then once you're in a very overcast, you don't even see your shadow, you can do f5, 6, and maybe even under the shade or something like that, you can go out on f4. Now, so basically that lets you use your shadow to tell you what f-stop to set the camera at. And that's how it works, the Sunny 16 rule. Simple and effective, and it works great. In a digital camera or a camera with a built-in meter, obviously, as you adjust the aperture, you can see the meter going, over or under exposed, and you want it in the middle, or the middle, wherever how your meter works, and that will make sure you're exposing right. But you can also see and experiment, and you can actually turn the dial of the aperture, and you can actually see the needle go up and down, or the LED or whatever. So it's the same exact thing. And here's another example I shot using this digital SLR. It's great for portraits and stuff like that because I can go down. I find that any lens that's slower than f2.8, you really want to get f2, f2.8, even maybe 1.4 if you want some dramatic depth of field. Another thing that you have to remember is that the out of focus areas are going to be a lot, more out of focus if you're closer to the subject versus farther away from the subject. So here's an example I shot with this lens, and it's shooting my Rolleiflex, and in the first shot you can see that I shot it at f1.4. So the background, you can see the wall behind it is going to be, very out of focus, and it's only going to be focused pretty much on the camera around that area. The second example is the same shot, except for I did it at 8. So it's a lot sharper. So basically the depth of field is a lot wider. So the camera's in focus, and as well as most of the wall behind it is in focus. Well, I hope this helps with getting a grasp on the aperture. You just got to remember, the higher the number of the aperture, the less light that comes in. The lower the number of the aperture, the more light comes in. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it helps you out. And go out there and just mess around and experiment with different depth of field effects and stuff like that. And don't be afraid to switch your camera on manual mode if you have a digital. And for all my analog friends, I'm sure you guys already know this basic knowledge, but I hope out there that I'm helping somebody get a grasp on the basics of manual photography. Next episode we'll be talking about shutter speed and how that works in relation to aperture and f-stops. Alright, thanks and have a great day. Peace!